Unabashed.
The most unpredictable.
Becomes a headline.
The most volatile.
Outrageous behavior.
Unsubstantiated narratives.
A battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha. I'm your guest host, Lauren Dueck. I usually work with Milan behind the scenes on this show, but this week I'm behind the microphone so that I can put him in the hot seat. So I'm thrilled to be joined this week by Milan Vaishnav, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and host of the Grand Tamasha podcast. How's it going, Milan?
Great. It's funny to be on the other side from you, Lauren.
Now I'm not in the booth anymore. Where are you calling us from today?
So I'm actually in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, which sounds incredibly exotic, except it's gray and pouring rain. But we're taking advantage of a little post-election break and the fact that my kids are off of school. So we're doing this remotely via phone.
Sounds like a well-deserved vacation. But I'm going to ask you a few questions anyway, just to interrupt it for a moment or two.
Go for it.
So it is already old news by now that last week Narendra Modi and the BJP consolidated power by winning an incredible 352 seats, beating their previous record of 336 in the 2014 election. Now, many analysts called 2014 a black swan election. The BJP did extremely well in a relatively limited number of states and was up against an extremely unpopular Congress party. And yet in 2019, the BJP surpassed its 2014 tally. This begs the question, has the ground permanently shifted in Indian politics?
I think it has. I think many of us called the 2014 general election a black swan election, a perfect storm, because you had sort of anti-incumbency against the Congress party. You had a sense that the economy was in the dumps. You had this larger-than-life opposition leader in Narendra Modi, and all of these three things came together to lead to just a complete electoral rout on the part of the BJP. And so many, election analysts said, look, lightning's not going to strike twice, right? I mean, the BJP essentially ran the tables in a very small number of states last time. It's impossible for them to do it again. But lo and behold, they've done it again. And so I think there was a debate amongst political scientists 5 years ago about whether we had entered in India what people were calling the fourth party system. So there's been a kind of evolution over time from kind of single party dominance of the Congress party to a situation where we had a very kind of multipolar, fragmented electoral system where neither national party, the Congress, nor the BJP could really serve as a kind of gravitational center of the Indian political system. And I think what we're seeing in 2019 is essentially a consolidation of what we saw in 2014, that the BJP has emerged as a hegemonic force in Indian politics. Now, it's important to point out this doesn't mean that there won't be electoral setbacks from time to time. We saw this throughout the BJP's first 5 years in power. It lost, a number of critical state elections, not least, three elections in the Hindi belt in December 2018. But it means that essentially elections are fought in opposition to or in support of the BJP, that they become the way that the system is defined. And I think you don't even just focus on the national level, but look at the state level and the way in which the BJP has steadily expanded its footprint across the state level. Look at the upper house of parliament. So the elections we've just had are for the lower house of parliament. But the BJP alliance, the NDA, is likely to achieve a majority in the next 2 years in the upper house. So this is a pretty incredible consolidation of power, that we haven't seen really for decades.
So last week, Milan, you wrote a piece for the Washington Post in which you posed a really interesting question, which is that if it's the economy stupid, then why did Modi win? That is, it's common wisdom that strong economies help incumbents and weak economies hurt them. So how did he manage to win so handily given the mixed economic numbers coming out of India?
I think that's right. I mean, we have to go back to 2014 and remind ourselves that, Modi really campaigned at that time around on what he called bringing in Achhe Din. Achhe Din means sort of the good times, the good days for the Indian economy. He talked about creating millions of jobs, revitalizing India's sort of moribund investment cycle, getting Indian growth back on track. Now, large parts of that narrative really haven't materialized over the past 5 years. GDP growth has been solid, but not really stellar. We've seen lots of peaks and valleys over the past 5 years. Unemployment data, which is highly contested in India, both public and private data suggests that there's been a slowdown in job growth. Importantly, in rural areas, we've seen the growth in farm prices hit an 18-year low. We've seen wages in rural areas stagnate. So, a number of factors you could point to that show that the economy isn't firing on all cylinders. And yet, in spite of all of that, the BJP kind of defied these gloomy economic numbers to clinch, the first back-to-back single-party majority India's seen in over 3 decades. And I think you have to start here with the Modi factor, that he is just head and shoulders above every other politician in India, including Rahul Gandhi, in terms of the level of his popularity. While it's true that Gandhi has improved his standing, his favorability over the past few years, there's still a huge gap between the two leaders. The second important thing is that, Modi is frankly more popular than his own party. So 32% of respondents to a national survey, which was conducted after the elections, show that, these voters wouldn't have voted for the BJP alliance if Modi were not the prime ministerial candidate, which I think is a really telling statistic. What's also interesting from the same survey is that the salience of economic issues really declined over time. So, 21% of voters said that jobs or joblessness was the number one most important issue to them ahead of the election. That actually declined by almost 10 percentage points as the election went on. Economic issues as a whole declined in terms of their importance. And I think that's because leadership really was what was on the agenda this time, and that's what people were voting on. They were voting for a leader who, despite the fact that not everything kind of went his way, paradoxically felt that he was the best place to kind of deal with their economic grievances. And then you had a series of events that I think helped to really consolidate this. One, that the opposition still doesn't have a very popular leader and that they were badly fragmented. And number two, you had this tension between India and Pakistan, in which India retaliated against terrorist attacks on its soil in a pretty high-profile way. And I think what this did was to put, again, leadership in the form of national security on the agenda. So it's not as if people don't care about the economy, but they began to see economic issues through the filter of either national security or leadership. And so I think that's one way in which these salient issues became less important the longer the election went on.
People have talked a lot about the mandate that the BJP and Modi have going forward. What is it a mandate for?
So I think this is a really contested question with no easy answers. But if you think about the campaign, the campaign, again, was fought on the basis of basically asking people to place their trust in Modi, right? And so he openly campaigned, and this is actually something he's done going back to his time as chief minister, saying, when you're voting for the BJP, you're actually voting for me. It's this idea, we heard in the United States during the 2016 election, I alone can fix it, right? That was something Trump had said on the stump. Modi used kind of similar language. Now, the content of what that means in terms of, governance reforms, economic reforms, those were never really filled in. So I think in some sense, he has a lot of latitude to decide how he wants to transform the Indian economy. I do think that there's a feeling that because nationalism really was a hallmark of this campaign, that this is a campaign for a mandate for a more muscular India, both in terms of how it situates itself abroad, as well as the kind of Hindu identity at home. So just starting with the point abroad, it's the first election that one can really remember in recent memory where voters said, Modi's really put India on the map. Our image has improved, right? There's a sense that India is a great power and Modi understands that and is leading India in that direction. And the second is, he had used openly kind of pro-Hindu tropes on the campaign trail. And I think, a lot of Hindus feel that they've been made to feel like a minority community over the past several decades. And here you finally have an unabashed, proud Hindu who wants to tilt the playing field. So I think it's really a combination of these factors. Now, what we don't know is, how Modi himself is going to interpret the mandate, and that in some ways is the most important question.
Has he given any indication that you've seen so far about any of the changes that will actually happen going forward, whether in India's foreign policy, international relations, or domestically?
So we've actually seen some interesting statements and leaks from the government. So the first statement is, Modi's address to his NDA allies in Parliament shortly after the election, where he doubled down on actually inclusive rhetoric and said, we need to recognize that minorities feel insecure, and we have to bring them along. That this is a mandate to, really cater to the electorate as a whole, not just the people that voted for you. So he struck a lot of the right notes in terms of trying to establish some healing after an incredibly divisive, a really ugly campaign. I don't think there's any way to describe it other than that. And we've seen a few leaks from the government. Now, these are just leaks, so one should treat them with caution, talking about some pretty significant economic reforms, such as privatizing Air India, which is India's state-owned airline, which has been consistently loss-making. It's something that the government tried to do kind of half-heartedly during the Modi government's first term. But if they were to really push that in a real way, that would be significant. They've also talked about doing things like reforming labor laws. Now, not necessarily in the sweeping way that economists had hoped, but at least in terms of rationalizing some of the labor laws that are on the books. Now, these are leaks. We've seen these before. I don't think we should necessarily jump to any conclusions. But in terms of the grumblings that are coming out through the press, I would say on both these scores, these are positive signs.
So that's interesting, because I was about to ask you the question, and I still will, especially given the majoritarian rhetoric that Modi campaigned on and that the BJP seems to have won on. What does this say about the future of Indian secularism?
I think for a while now, commentators have been saying, and I've gone on record saying this in a recent piece in Foreign Affairs, that the Nehruvian concept of secularism is pretty much dead. And what I mean by that is, there was a very peculiar way in which secularism was applied in India to mean not a strict separation between church and state, but rather that the state would maintain a roughly equal embrace of and equal distance from all the religious faiths. So the state could do things like administer educational institutions that impart religious instruction. They could subsidize, pilgrimages of various religious orders, but that they would have to do so in an even-handed way. And I think that construct now has been completely hollowed out because so many politicians have kind of opportunistically used the idea of secularism to kind of cater to particular vote banks. And so they pandered to religion when it suited their interests, and then they retreated to this holier-than-thou secularism, secularist approach. And I think they've been called out now. So what's unclear is how so-called secular parties like the Congress and some of the regional opposition are going to reconstruct an idea of secularism. Or are they going to essentially shift rightwards and say, you know what? This is a country that's 80% Hindu, and we're not majoritarian in the same way that the BJP is. We don't believe in Hindutva or kind of Hindu nationalism, but we do feel that, this is a country that largely has to abide by fundamental Hindu religious tenets. And we don't know which way they're going to go. All we can say is that they're in a real hole, and this election proved that they're not really quite sure how to get out of it.
That leads beautifully to my next question, which is, after all our conversation about the BJP, I want to ask about Congress. What's going to happen to the Congress party? What's going to happen to their leadership? How are they going to regroup after this?
So I have always been skeptical that the Congress is going to take this opportunity for some deep self-reflection and introspection. That's not something that Congress has often done, and they didn't really do it at all after 2014. And so what we've seen thus far is a meeting of the Congress Working Committee, which is the kind of apex body of the Congress. Rahul Gandhi tendered his resignation at that meeting, which is kind of par for the course, and the CWC, this Congress committee, rejected it. But what happened next is quite interesting, which is Rahul Gandhi is basically threatening to reject their rejection of his resignation. And so he has called for another high-level meeting of the Congress to say, I want you guys to put forward another name. And it can't be me or my sister or someone else who has Gandhi in their last name. Now, if this happened, it would be quite unprecedented for a sitting dynast, and the Congress is a dynastic party, to step aside in favor of someone else. It's happened very rarely throughout the over 100-year history of this party. And so we'll have to wait and see. But if that happens, that could be quite transformative, and it could go either way. I mean, the party could fall apart because the Gandhi family has been the glue that's kept it together, or it could lead to a process of regeneration. I don't think that the Gandhis will go away. They will still play maybe a mentor role, even if they don't directly control the reins of the party. But, this is just speculation for now. We have to see how this plays out. But I'll just, point to one last thing, Lauren, which is the Congress Party got about 20% of the All India vote. So 1 in 5 voters voted for the Congress. That's the identical share to 2014. So they seem to have a floor in terms of their popularity. And there's still a number of states out there which are two-party states in which the BJP and the Congress are going head-to-head. So, there is a reservoir of support for them, and they could lean back on that to say, we don't need to do any internal shuffling. I think that would be the wrong decision, but it's one possible way that they could go.
What do we learn about the fate of third parties going forward? Just as one example, the BSP had a terrible performance in UP this election. Is the political constituency that had voted for regional and caste-based parties moving their votes elsewhere?
They clearly are. I mean, I think in 2014, the BJP did extremely well against these caste-based regional parties. So parties like the BSP of Mayawati, the Samajwadi Party, the RJD, which is another backward caste party in Bihar. But they did not do so well against regionalist parties. And the regionalist parties are parties that aren't necessarily caste-based, but are tied to a subnational, regional, linguistic and cultural identity. So these are the parties that are reign supreme in West Bengal, in southern states like Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Orissa, which is another eastern state. What changed between 2014 and 2019 is actually the BJP has posed a threat to those regionalist parties as well. So it did extremely well in West Bengal and Odisha. It won seats in Telangana, which no one had foreseen. And so part of the way they're doing this, again, is I think through the appeal of Modi. I think secondly that there is a degree of frustration with these parties, which have essentially ruled as kind of personal fiefdoms for a long time. And, what the BJP has done very skillfully is positioned itself as the major opposition party. It has taken the space that the Congress had traditionally occupied. And as we've seen the Congress organization wither away, the BJP has cherry-picked a lot of that opposition and essentially brought it over to its side. So I think it now poses an existential threat to really, frankly, almost all ruling parties in all states that are not the Congress Party, and that's a big shift from what we've seen in the past.
So I have one more question for you that is focused on your very specific area of expertise, which is the intersection of criminality and politics in India. So in the previous parliament, 21% of office holders had serious criminal charges levied against them. Do you have any data yet or information on how this class compares?
We do. So what we know from 2014 is that 34% of incoming members of parliament faced criminal cases at the time of their election, and that 21% of these individuals faced serious cases. And serious cases are cases that essentially would merit real jail time if a conviction were obtained. Now, what we're seeing this time, the data has just come out, is 43%, so an increase from 34 to 43%, have cases, and 29% have serious cases. So since this data has been collected, we only have this data from 2004, we've seen the numbers of both kinds increase. And so I think this is a challenge that is fundamental, I think, to Indian political economy. And it shows you that this is really a pan-Indian phenomenon. It's a pan-party phenomenon. And despite all the talk of good governance and reform and anti-corruption and cleaning up the system, this is really something that Mr. Modi and his successors are going to have to tackle because it doesn't show any signs of really going away.
Wow, those are some incredible numbers. Yikes. I want to conclude our conversation by asking you, as we do every week, to share one story coming out of India that you think hasn't been adequately reported. What's your underreported story of the week?
So my underreported story of the week really has to do with dynastic politics. A lot of people have been talking, especially on social media, about how this election shows that, dynastic politics are over. And the data has just come in, and this is data collected by the Ashoka University, the Trivedi Center for Political Data. We had Gilles Vernier, who's the co-director of that center, on the show last week. 30% of members of parliament are dynasts, which means that they have an immediate family member who preceded them in politics. And what's interesting is that when you look at the partisan breakdown, is 31% of Congress MPs are dynastic and 22% of BJP MPs are dynastic. So while it's true that the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty of the Congress Party has underperformed, and you could point to some regional parties which have been dynastic, have done poorly, a fair number of dynastic MPs and other dynastic parties have done pretty well. So this is something that, despite all the talk about it being kind of, at death's door, seems to be, pretty steady.
So my underreported story of the week isn't so much a story, but an interview that I would love everyone to read. So at the end of last week, Isaac Chotiner of The New Yorker interviewed the political theorist Pratap Bhanu Mehta about Modi's victory and what it says about how Indian society is changing. It's a really fascinating discussion. I'd encourage everyone to read it. He's got a lot of very interesting insights that helped me think about how to interpret the election results and what it means for the future. One more weekly question for you, Milan, or two more, I should say. So who had the best week in India this week?
So I'm going to not give the obvious answer, which is Modi, BJP, Amit Shah, and instead point the finger to Jagan Reddy. Jagan Reddy is the president of the YSR Congress Party, which swept to power in the state assembly of Andhra Pradesh. Out of 175 seats, it won 151, so a complete decimation. Andhra Pradesh has 25 parliamentary seats. Jagan Reddy's party won 22. Jagan Reddy's an interesting character. He is the son of YSR, who was a popular former Congress chief minister of Andhra Pradesh, who died under tragic circumstances in a helicopter crash. And Jagan Reddy saw himself as the rightful inheritor of his father's legacy and wanted to be made chief minister of Andhra Pradesh. The Congress Party, which is not fond of having very powerful or charismatic state leaders who have their own independent political base, scoffed at the idea. They were also turned off by the fact that Jagan Reddy had seen a fantastic increase in his wealth when his dad was chief minister. And so there were a number of ongoing investigations into his, the euphemism in India for corruption is disproportionate assets. And so he was basically sidelined. He spent some time in jail, but he's out now, and he didn't do so great in 2014, which is the first time his party contested statewide and in parliamentary elections. But they've really romped home here, and he has established himself, pretty quickly now as an important provincial leader who I think has, larger aspirations.
And what about the worst week?
So here it's hard to avoid the Congress, and I'm going to specifically talk about the Nehru-Gandhi family. I mean, this is a party whose hold on the party has really gone back to pre-independence times. You've seen Rahul Gandhi as party president perform extremely poorly. He lost his own seat in Amethi in Uttar Pradesh, although he kept a second seat in Kerala, so he'll still be represented in the Lok Sabha. His sister Priyanka really jumped into mainstream politics this time as a star campaigner for the Congress Party in Uttar Pradesh, where the Congress was really only able to win one seat, which was Sonia Gandhi's seat, who is the matriarch or the mother of Rahul and Priyanka. And more symbolically, this year, in fact, this weekend, was the 55th death anniversary of Prime Minister Nehru, who was, of course, the leader of the family, whose daughter Indira Gandhi, who is Rahul and Priyanka's grandmother, both served as prime ministers. And it kind of went without much notice. Prime Minister Modi and the BJP have made no secret of the fact that they are not admirers of Nehru. They would like to replace him in the pantheon of Indian leaders with people they see as more favorable to their ideological point of view. And so I think this really was a bad week for the Nehru Gandhi family, and it's quite likely it's going to get even worse as time goes on.
Well, Milan, thank you so much for letting me borrow your seat for the week. I promise to give it back when you're back in D.C., and we're back to our regularly scheduled programming next week.
Thanks so much, Lauren. It's fun to be on this side, but I think I like being on the host seat more, so look forward to getting back there next week.
Great. Well, after a short break, we will be back with Milan's conversation with political scientist Devesh Kapur on the Indian state.
My guest on the podcast today is Devesh Kapur. Devesh is the Starr Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and Director of Asia Programs at Johns Hopkins SAIS, right across the street. Before coming to SAIS, Devesh was the Director of the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania for more than a decade. He's an authority on subjects as wide-ranging as migration to higher education, to urbanization and public institutions. His most recent book, published earlier this year, is Regulation in India, Design, Capacity, Performance, which he co-edited with Madhav Khosla. It's an absolute pleasure for me to have him in the studio today. Devesh, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Lick, for having me.
So, Devesh, a conversation with you could go a million different directions, but I want to devote the bulk of our time today to talking about the issue of state capacity in India, which is something you've thought quite a lot about. You probably more than anyone I know for a number of years have been sounding the alarm about the need to take India's institutional shortcomings seriously. For those who haven't been paying close attention, what exactly is the problem with the Indian state? How would you describe it to a layperson?
Well, suppose one starts off by just thinking what's the function of institutions, right? So the sort of classic way we think about it is that they sort of define the rules of the game, they set expectations about the behavior of all the actors who are involved in that game. And if you think of something that's happening right now, which is the elections, right? You have the institution of the Election Commission. You know how and why it matters when you compare it to the US, which is a far more developed democracy. But the one institution it lacks is a strong election commission. And we've seen these sorts of problems that elections have faced here in the last decade or so. The same thing if you take another institution, the Delimitation Commission in India. Again, when you see its absence in the case of the US, you see the gerrymandering shenanigans that go on, which really sort of undermines the broad democratic ethos in some ways.
And the Delimitation Commission, just for some of our listeners who may not know, is an independent agency that does redistricting for the entire country.
Right. And so now these are some examples of the strengths of India's institutions and the very positive role that they've played. But I think if we look at a range of institutions, so, for instance, the modern state is a regulatory state. And India's regulatory institutions have really not been up to the mark. In some ways, that includes the Reserve Bank of India. When you look at the financial crisis in India, the banking, that is because the regulator was the RBI. Now, arguably, its hands were tied because many of these banks are state-owned banks, right? So it becomes much harder for a regulator to regulate something that is a part of the state. But, the Central Electricity Commission, the Competition Commission, all of these, there are now dozens of regulatory institutions. And for many of them, they are not playing the role they're supposed to. And that has wide implications for the economy, for equity, and for India's future.
So in some research that you've been doing, I was struck by the observation that you made, and we've talked about this in the past, that if you look at the Indian state, it seems to work better where delivery is kind of episodic,
right?
Where you have what you call inbuilt exit, right?
Right.
Compared to situations where, say, delivery and accountability are kind of more reliant on everyday kind of state capacity at the local levels. So, what is it about episodic delivery and inbuilt exit, as you put it, that gives certain institutions an advantage over others?
I can't say I have a completely satisfactory explanation. I mean, again, going back to the election commission, right, which you know much better than I do, that its normal strength is a few hundred people.
Correct.
But during the time of elections, virtually the entire country's bureaucracy sort of reports to it.
Right, as many as 12 million officials are on election duty in a general election.
Right? Now, but the day the elections are over, those 12 million basically go back to their day-to-day jobs.
Their teachers, their doctors,
or,
their local
administrators, And so that's where you see the automatic exit, right? The other ones that have done well, the Finance Commission and the Delimitation Commission, they all set up periodically. They do their work and then they fold up, right? Now, I think one is whether, that time frame they have. I mean, to give other examples, one thing which, again, you and I have talked about, the Kumbh Mela, right? The same UP government, which basically does very few things well on a day-to-day basis. This is something where more than 200 million people were there over 50 days. The world's largest gathering of humanity.
And they basically put up a temporary city for all of these people.
Right. And yet, broadly it went off pretty well without any serious mishaps and pretty well organized, from sanitation to personal security. Everything. Now, the question is, yet if you look at urbanization in UP, by and large, it's a pretty sad story, right? And one is that whether when something is episodic, it sort of concentrates the mind and the energy, right? And that when it comes to day-to-day activities, there are far more pressures, right? Both from the bottom, from citizens as well as from above. But that to me is still not fully, I don't know if I fully buy that as a complete explanation of this phenomenon. Maybe the fact, that by the time negative things begin to emerge, already it's time to exit. So, you start, you finish, it's like an exam, right? An exam we know concentrates our mind. We all would like to study every day, but by and large we know the exams really don't test on many things. But the one thing it does do, it forces you to study. You do it for 3 hours and then it's done.
In researching the Election Commission, one of the things that I found is that there is a internal esprit de corps, right? This sense of pride because you've had a relatively well-managed agency that creates a kind of can-do public culture within the institution that carries down to the lowest officer who's on district election duty, who has a sense of pride.
Right.
And the second thing is it's a highly visible act, right? It speaks to the fundamental prestige of a society or a democracy.
Right.
That is different from kind of everyday dealing with welfare delivery
Right.
or health and education. When we think about the state, one of the notions that gets talked about in the political science literature is this idea of India as a patronage democracy, right? And that accounts for its poor performance. Now, I know in conversations with you over the years, you've never been very happy with this term patronage democracy. Why do you think that that's an inexact or inaccurate way of capturing or summarizing the Indian state?
So it's how we think of the word patronage, right? One might be patronage as there are contracts and I direct those contracts towards my supporters. That's one type of patronage. The other type of patronage is where sort of so-called jobs for the boys, right? I stuff the bureaucracy with my...
I'm a political leader. I use my political networks to give my supporters jobs in the bureaucracy.
Best sort of equivalent would be like Tammany Hall.
Right, the spoil system.
Exactly, right? I think the first is there, less than we think now, because a lot of these things are e-tendering, etc. And there, surely there are rents and bribes and all of that. But that is not necessarily going to your guys, whoever's giving you the money, The one that I've been more skeptical about is the second, that you're stuffing it. Because if you were really doing patronage well, the state should have grown, right? Almost by definition. Because if I'm stuffing it, each person comes in, you put in your guys, it's very hard to fire people. But actually, the Indian state's overall size has been declining steadily.
So this is something that is a common misperception, that you have a large, gargantuan bureaucracy that's in everybody's face in every corner. But you point out that in personnel terms anyway,
right,
the Indian state is not only small, but declining in terms of size?
Yeah. And that's something I think we really... the two things that really struck us is that, and this, by the way, is when I talk of the Indian state, right? There is the Indian state, which is the bureaucracy. In the mid-50s, 57% of central government employees were employed by one entity, the Indian Railways. Even now, it's about 40% is Indian Railways. Then you have the public sector banks, right? If you take these two away, the Indian state per capita is about 1/3 the size of the US. And the US doesn't believe in the state. Right. Every party, at least one party definitely does not believe in the state. In India, there's no party that doesn't believe in the state. And yet, you see, its relative size is much small. The size per million really peaked in the late 80s. And it's been really declining since.
So, one of the concepts you talk about, and this is something that Arvind Subramaniam has also talked about in recent work, is this idea of India as a precocious democracy, right? So we tend to think of democracy as a good thing for the broader public because when it comes to public goods, democracies, unlike autocracies, have to be responsive to the average voter, because if they're not responsive to the average voter, then they get chucked out. What is it about the precociousness of Indian democracy that has inhibited, say, the functioning of the state, right? Is it just a question of sequencing, or is it something more?
So one thing, what we found, and this sort of Arvind was the one who really pointed this out, was that there are two features of franchise in India that I think are worth noting. One is the level of income and education when you get the franchise. The second is that in all Western democracies, Japan, Korea, in all these countries, not Korea, which I'll come to later, is that the franchise was extended gradually over time, right? So first, as you know, in the US, it was landed elites, then landed males, then all males.
All white males.
White males, I'm sorry. And then all males, and then women, right? So, and that took the better part of century plus, right? In India, there was some very limited franchise in 1936, when the elections were held then, but otherwise, barely, in 51. Everyone got it.
Post-independence, one shot, men, women, basically anyone of voting age.
Right. And
irrespective of caste, class, so on.
And also, there were no things about wealth or education, any. Now, what we found was that all the other countries, by the time universal franchise was granted, they already had a foundation of public goods. Especially, so if you compare two things, right, which we think about as core public goods, primary education and health. So if you look at primary education levels in India, they were abysmal, as you know, in the early 50s. Life expectancy, which is one way you think about health, was half what it was in many of the countries when they got a universal franchise. So what we argue was that what this did was to put far more pressures. Once you get to the democracy in an unequal, there are far more pressures on redistribution. And so a lot of the efforts of the Indian state and the pressures have gone on redistribution, and which you see in this election, right? All the election manifestos. But even in this election, the commitment to building the core platform of public goods, all the things we talk about, the sanitation, the water, excellent primary, secondary schooling, excellent public health, that is still lacking, right? But all the parties are willing to spend in their manifestos and otherwise tens of billions of dollars in redistributive programs, but you don't see as much of a passion, you don't see as much of a demand, it seems, for
I mean, just
public
take health and education, for instance. I mean, they are given some passing mention in the manifesto, but they're not election issues per se, right? I mean, I think aside from maybe the city-state of New Delhi, where Aam Aadmi Party has
done.
made this more
Right.
politically salient, and
Right.
that's a very limited context. They're
Right.
broadly speaking not,
not,
on
yeah. the
ballot, as it were.
Exactly. And that's what we think, that the precocious democracy had this so-called cost, was that the redistributive pressures came too early prior to building a platform of public goods. And in the end, it's not that India became more equal because of redistribution. It certainly has not, right? I mean, because you didn't create that platform so that everyone had at least a less uneven playing field.
But presumably part of the story has to be that after independence, the Indian state was counted upon to do a great many things.
Right.
It was not equipped or resourced to do so. And as a result, people with means who were of the middle or upper middle classes decided to exit the system.
Right.
And take away from public schools and instead invest in private education, private water, private security. And so is part of the challenges you see with the Indian state trying to get back that middle class engagement with fundamental, day-to-day kind of civic amenities and kind of public goods?
So I think that has been stymied because the other part of state building was also stymied because that fiscal contract, right, where the state provides these public services, but in return people pay taxes. And especially, as you know, in this case, the direct taxes matter more in strengthening that contract. And what you find is that actually, for its level of per capita income, the tax to GDP ratio, India is not an outlier. But for a democracy, it is much below than what it ought to be. So when you don't have those fiscal resources, that also makes it harder, right, to spend on the sorts of goods, especially at the local level, which is, the usual health, education, etc. I should add one more thing which we find is India is unusual in the structure of the state itself. If you look at China, US, the other two of the largest federal systems, the public employment, it's a U-shaped curve where at the federal level and local level is where you have the maximum number of employees, but at the state or the subnational level is where you have relatively few. India is an inverted U. Federal and local is much less. It's really centralized at the state level. Now, as you know, since most states are larger than most countries, it's a huge degree of centralization, right? And so the real absence of resources, human and financial at the local level, is why many of the things when you go to India, what are lacking, right? Urban amenities, right? Sanitation, water. These are all local public goods. And that's where the Indian state in some ways is the most absent. And it is the most absent because it's the most deprived of resources.
So presumably, if you had a greater, this goes back to the debate about, taxation and representation, right? Because if you're taxed, then you demand accountability.
Right.
It creates that social contract. But the second part of it is that you have to be taxed at the right level also, right?
Exactly.
Because if it's the city of D.C. who is taking all of your taxes, then if that pothole on your road isn't fixed, you're going to go to your city council person or your neighborhood representative and so on and so forth. And I guess one of the issues you're pointing to is that in a state like UP, which has, say, 240 million people, you're in some far-flung part of it. Lucknow seems like
light years away.
Right.
Yeah.
Let me just move this conversation to the present, and I want to ask you a question about the last 5 years. The Modi government came to office with high hopes that it would tackle some of the major challenges of governance and administrative reform, and it's something that then when he was Chief Minister, Modi turned prime ministerial candidate, talked a lot about. 5 years on, granted it's only one term, but how do you assess its record so far in terms of governance reform? If you were to kind of look at kind of the broad, kind of stylized picture.
In one word, disappointing. Certainly compared to what he had campaigned, very little was done. I think the one thing that he did do in the last few months, actually, I mean, it's now been implemented, is this lateral hiring in the civil service. I think 7 or 9 joint secretaries.
They've opened up a number of joint secretary positions to people coming from the outside. So it could be private sector, it could be a think tank, it could be civil society.
Right. So people who have real domain expertise. And there was a big brouhaha that the skies would fall down, etc., which I think has absolutely not been the case. And these people seem to have they've come through the UPSC, which is the Union Public Service Commission, which is another constitutional body which has tries to shield from too much political pressure. But other than that, there are very few areas. If anything, there are worries that many institutions, central universities, the choices of vice chancellors, say something, the agrarian crisis, right? Agricultural research, more than half the research institutes don't even have a director. So it's not even that the quality of people you choose. There doesn't seem to be any urgency to even have people lead these institutions in place, in time, right? And in a number of cases, I would say, as you know, this election commission, which I think we all agree has been one of India's best institutions, there have been questions raised about its impartiality, the degree of fairness, and there is some reason to believe, that the people chosen to head these institutions are chosen with sort of a loyalty test, so to speak, in mind, rather than necessarily the sense of independence and commitment to the institution per se.
Let me just end by asking you one last question about the future. So this episode will air after the elections are over. Irrespective of who comes to power, if you had to, say, advise the next government, what are maybe 2 or 3 priority areas you would like to see more attention paid to when it comes to the Indian state? What do you think are in some ways the most acute sectors or areas that deserve attention?
I think one could think of 3. One is just fill vacancies, right? Especially where you have, for instance, we know the banking crisis, right? Public sector banks, the CEOs, exactly, because in India, exactly when they're going to retire. So you should have the replacement in place, all set up, rather than just leave it vacant. Because, and that is true of our courts, almost all parts, exactly when someone is going to retire. So you should have the replacement in place prior to that. There's no excuse for that. The second is transfers, right? That is the one thing that is used and misused egregiously. And I think in India, we talked about the patronage part. When it comes to selection into the bureaucracy, it is actually a pretty decent system.
Because by and large, it's pretty much exam-based.
Exactly, right? You could argue whether it's the right exam or whatever, but, it's not something that is hugely manipulated.
You could not, if you were coming from a wealthy family, pay enough to get your kid into the IAS, for instance.
You could do it at Stanford, but not into the IAS. But once you get in, that's where the transfer Raj, as we know, the transfer Raj has become like the license Raj. It's a deeply inimical thing, especially on the police and civil servants. People who act on principle are easily transferred out. And I think one needs safeguards, ways in which they are in place for sustained periods of time in order to do their job. And I think a third is a little more on getting more expertise into the Indian state. I think the day of the generalist, and there still is an important place. But for instance, India's urban, future. As we know, urban governance is very weak. You need people trained as managers of urban areas, of cities. You need to create an urban cadre, people who really understand, right? That, as you know, is hardly there. Someone who was in health or, education, tomorrow you make him the person in charge of a sort of municipality. It's a skill that is acquired, and that expertise in a sense needs to be far more nurtured within the civil service than is the case now.
I remember an anecdote that I think it came from something that Gulzar Natarajan had written, who's a civil servant who was the commissioner in Hyderabad.
Right.
About, I think in the entire city, which is one of India's largest metros,
Right.
I think there were maybe a handful, below 5 food inspectors, right? I mean, it just shows you both the issue in terms of kind of, personnel
Right.
and resources right there, right?
Exactly.
Devesh, we look forward to reading more about what you have to say on the Indian state in the months and years to come, but thanks so much for joining us on the show. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jamie Hinson and Rachel Osnos. Tim Martin's our audio engineer, and Lauren Dueck's our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.